there was this perception on the internet for several years that you have to eat once a day. That's it. You have to fast for 22 hours or 23 hours a day to get the benefits. But that's really not what the human data suggests.
About a month ago, you posted something to YouTube that I bet a lot of people found quite surprising. You've been a big proponent of fasting for a long time now, talking about the benefits, and you've incorporated that into your lifestyle for quite a period of time. You talked about how you're cutting back. So let's talk about what spurred that on and what that's been like.
Yeah, Jesse, great question. Like many things that we embark on that are novel and unique, I embarked on after interviewing Dr. Jason Fung in Toronto. I started to get into in 2016. I think that's when it was get into a lot of extended fasting. So 3-day fast periodically. The most I ever did was 5 days, and I started to do a lot of those sort of fasts. And although I did feel quite good and but didn't have a lot of weight to lose, was already sort of at 12, 13% body fat. I started to notice, Jesse, that I was getting weaker with time and started to kind of affect me mentally, thinking that, gosh, well, I'm getting closer to 40. Maybe it's just because I'm aging. That's probably not a good thing. And I have decided over the last year that, gosh, I don't know that extended fasting for someone that isn't overweight or obese is really enhancing my life expectancy, provided the data now that we know that muscle is in fact an endocrine organ. Muscle mass is independently correlated with all-cause mortality. Even grip strength and so forth is linked with severe COVID-19 and increased risk of death. So as you age, there's this fine balance between sort of optimizing muscle tone, muscle strength, and so forth, and then also sort of getting into this calorie deficit, periodically calorie restriction. So trying to sort of balance that. And what I've since done is, instead of doing extended fasting, really just sticking to early time restricted feeding on a regular basis, but really prioritizing workouts, because it turns out that the cellular mechanisms that are linked with all the benefits of prolonged fasting are actually also similarly increased when we exercise. So that to me was sort of looking at this research, studying this. I created this autophagy enhancer masterclass course, and so I was just really diving into all that research, and I was like, gosh, there's actually more data in humans to suggest that exercise is a powerful inducer of this key metabolic pathway that tends to decline with age, known as autophagy. So why are we so focused on fasting when we can upregulate autophagy by way of exercise? And I can share with you studies and more, but I'm sure you have some follow-up questions before we keep going.
So what I'm hearing you say, you're not totally against fasting, but it's more of balancing that with the exercise for you personally, where you're at in your life. And another important point I want to highlight here is the fact that there's this overlap in benefits that you're getting from exercise that maybe before you were getting from the fasting.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of shared mechanisms, so if we think about what happens when you fast, you decrease your blood glucose, you decrease blood insulin, you can increase glucagon, you start to mobilize fatty acids. Well, those same sort of metabolic pathways and that metabolic signature is actually increased when you exercise as well. So so I think, to me, consistent regular exercise paired with some more consistent regular feeding with the compression for people who are already metabolically healthy. And so that's, I think, a big point that we need to understand. If you're overweight, if you're morbidly obese, there's a lot of benefits to extended fasting. And for some of those people, regular exercise can become problematic as a consequence of the excess weight that they're already carrying. So, I think this is where precision needs to come into the conversation with any sort of lifestyle intervention that we talk about. We need to understand where our health history is, where we're currently at, and then sort of map out a more personalized approach going forward. So yeah, marrying the best of regular time restricted feeding with exercise, to me, seems like it makes a lot of sense.
And it's important we tease out a lot of these nuances because there are a lot of people that aren't metabolically healthy. So let's talk about, first of all, how many people are in that boat right now? And then again, for somebody who is, what might they want to do in the realm of fasting to heal that?
This is a excellent question, Jesse. And in fact, it is quite scary to know how many people have some degree of poor metabolic health. Studies from just a few years ago using the NHANES data here in the US, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's been an ongoing epidemiological study that has evaluated sort of the health trends in people over tens of thousands of people over years. And up to 2016, it was reported that about 83% of US adults, okay, we're speaking strictly here because that's the data that I know. I'm sure other countries are slightly different, but we're all trending in the same unhealthy direction, sadly. About 83% of adults had poor metabolic health. Now, a recent study just came out a few weeks ago finding that number has actually slid back even more. 93% of American adults have poor cardiometabolic health. So they have some degree of high blood pressure, insulin resistance, visceral adiposity, and that was just going up until 2018. And so we all know that what the pandemic did to obesity rates and metabolic disease and so forth. So yeah, this is quite common, unfortunately. And so that's why I think it's really important that people use a two-pronged approach. And again, looking at trying to exercise, trying to walk, trying to lift weights, because even if you're already fasting, the more exercise that you do, you actually increase and get more mileage from your fasts. And so I like to share people one study that actually found they randomized people based upon their body weight, to fast for different durations. And what one study actually found is that people who are regular exercisers have a more statistically significant increase in the autophagy related pathways compared to people who fast for 36 hours that are overweight and don't exercise. So again, if you're big into fasting and you're like, I love this, my 3-day or 5-day fast and so forth, well, you're actually going to get more mileage in terms of autophagy and different intracellular signaling pathways that will be increased if you become a habitual exerciser. And so that doesn't mean you need to be a gym rat. It just means you walk, after meals in particular. You do yoga, maybe you do gardening, whatever you like to do, and you can habitually do that. I think that's most important.
That's fascinating research talking about the autophagy related to the exercise, and I'd like you to expand upon that more for people that might not know what that word means. So
Yeah.
let's talk about what you're getting at there and why that's important.
Yeah, excellent point, Jesse. So the term autophagy has been sought after in recent years because it's an intracellular cleanup process. And unfortunately, this process tends to decline with age. And it's linked with the formation of aggregated proteins that can cause neurodegeneration in the brain and so forth. So as we age, our cells lose their ability to clean up intracellular debris. And so this process of autophagy is again linked with improving cellular function, particularly the defective organelles within the cell. So, we all have trillions of cells, and within those cells, we have very specific organelles. Just like within our house, we have our furnaces, we have our hot water here, we have our dishwasher, right? Our cells are very similar, and how our cells make and produce energy so that they can function, so that your neurons can transmit light and you can create memories and so forth. That is largely that energy to create, to enable cells to function is derived from the mitochondria. And it turns out that as we age, our mitochondria can be kind of sort of rusty, oxidative or free radical stress can damage the mitochondria. So we need to clean them up, and we need to break down their component elements and reuse those elements to construct brand new healthy mitochondria. Well, the process of autophagy really helps to clean up the mitochondria, clean up damaged, deranged proteins, glycated proteins, and issues like that within cells and on cells. So this is why autophagy is important. Again, the rates of autophagy they're a little bit tissue specific. For example, more autophagy might be occurring in the liver when you're fasting compared to in skeletal muscle, right? So there is some tissue specificity here. It's not this on or off thing it's been sort of oversimplified on the internet. But the nice thing is we now know ways that we can improve this intracellular process. One study in June of 2019 found when individuals embark on just time-restricted feeding, and this was a feeding window that may not be practical for working parents and, like yourself with young children or myself, but it's just important to understand that just compressing your feeding window and eating between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And comparing and contrasting autophagy initiation proteins and transcription factors in that group compared to a group who ate identical numbers of quantity of energy, overall calories, that was controlled in this study. What the researchers found is that when people just eat ad lib between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., the folks that ate earlier between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. had a significant increase in, again, gene transcription, so genes that are turning on to initiate these longevity pathways, including but not limited to upregulating autophagy. And there was also a decrease in a protein known as mTOR that is linked with when it's chronically overexpressed. mTOR, sort of like the opposite end of the spectrum compared to autophagy. mTOR overexpression is linked with cellular growth, cancer, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and neurodegenerative diseases. So that early feeding window group noted a significant reduction in mTOR compared to the ad lib feeding group that ate all day, and then a significant increase in autophagy and other longevity and cancer preventative enzymes. So again, it's important to understand that we don't have to take these drastic measures. And that's why, when I made that video, why I quit fasting, it's really why I quit extended fasting, because, keeping in mind all these different factors. And if we're just consistent with our daily feeding windows, and our body fat is kept in healthy levels from exercise, and maybe we don't need to rely upon these extended fasts as much.
I'd be curious if it was further teased apart to see how much of that benefit came from the more narrow eating window versus having that earlier eating window, because a lot of people who are intermittent fasting are skipping breakfast. And in this case, you're talking about eating that first meal of the day, having a breakfast, and then basically having an earlier dinner and then not eating later in the evening.
I mean, it sounds like we're splitting hairs here, but it's a really great point, Jesse, because it's unfortunate. A lot of people have gotten into fasting and I understand it's easy to start skipping breakfast. It's harder to start your fast at 4, meaning cutting off your feeding window but there are actual health benefits linked to this. The closer that you eat before bed, let's say you fast all day and you start feeding again at 4 p.m. and then maybe you have your last snack or something at 10 o'clock and you go to bed at 11, right? The closer that you're pushing those calories towards bed, the more likely you are to put on body fat. And this was, again, there was a recent study it was fall of, I think it was 2021 or 2020, where they randomized women to 2 different groups and had them have a 600 calorie snack in addition to dinner. Now they stratified people to either have that snack with their dinner. So they had, energy, again, in this study was controlled. And then they had women not have the snack with dinner, but have these 600 calories sometime after dinner. So they could have it right before bed, an hour before bed or whatever. And they followed these women for 8 weeks and found that the women that were in the group that ate the 600 calorie snack sometime after dinner, but not with dinner, put on more visceral fat. And so there's a really good thing to remember is you want to stop eating within 6 hours of your midpoint of sleep. Now, I know people are like trying to do math, right? But it's within basically 4 hours before you get to bed is roughly between 3 and 4 hours. If you can stop feeding, so it's fine. If you don't like breakfast and you're hearing Jesse and I talk about early time restricted feeding, you're like, I could never do that. I'm not a breakfast person. That's fine. But maybe start, instead of waiting until 8 o'clock to eat, maybe wait until 11 or noon. And that's generally what I do. I'll start feeding around 11, 11. And that's really generally when I start to get hungry because again, I've gone for a walk in the morning, gone outside, exposed my retina to sunlight and so forth. And then try to have dinner earlier, like around 6, and then just not have any snacks or things like that. And go for a walk after dinner. And that's when the fast starts, right? So again, instead of thinking I have to start my fast for breakfast, think if I eat earlier, that's the start of my fast. And again, that is linked with benefits there. And Jesse, just one more quick thing here that I think is important to understand is when we eat with alignment with our body's circadian clock system, we have other beneficial effects like improving sleep and in training this circadian clock system. So if we bookend our day with a bunch of calories, like you said, most people get into intermittent fasting. They're eating a big dinner and then they go to bed, right? And they fast all day. Well, your gut is actually, from a circadian rhythm perspective, not in the most prime state to digest and break down and process all those calories that you ate. All of our bodily systems, from our pancreas to our stomach to our small intestine to our skeletal muscle to the gonads. These are all influenced by our circadian clock system. And the gut circadian clock shows that motility, peristaltis, all the enzymes, the hydrochloric acid, the pepsin, the bile acids, all of these things are actually in their peak around the middle part of the day. That's when ghrelin levels generally are higher, leptin levels are lower. It's this hormonal sort of milieu that suggests that we should be eating as humans during that point of time. And so we want to optimize and support and foster these peripheral circadian clocks, like the gut clock, like the clocks within the muscle and the pancreas. They influence and feed back into the central circadian clock. And this all comes back to helping to support sleep. This is where a lot of people struggle in life is they're poor sleepers. They are up late at nights. They can't fall asleep. Their mind is racing. So anything that we can do to help foster a good night's sleep is important, and structuring our feeding windows associated with optimal circadian rhythm alignment helps with sleep, and vice versa. So I think that's another big thing. If nothing else, is if you fast all day and have a big meal, not only does just from a mechanical standpoint, you have all this food in your stomach, and your stomachs and intestines are trying to break it down while you're trying to sleep, and that's not a good thing. So you get better sleep if you eat earlier in the day as well.
So what I'm hearing you say here is if you're not going to have that earlier dinner because maybe like us, you mentioned having young kids, socially it might not work so well for you, make sure you're at least giving yourself 4 hours to digest before bed
Exactly.
as at least the entry point step for people.
Totally. And I understand the family dynamics. I love family dinners as much as anyone and things like that. And if that's in your if kids are back late from soccer practice or baseball or sports or whatever, maybe you just have a smaller meal then, and you make lunch your bigger meal, and you can still eat with the family, but you don't have to have this massive meal. So that's another thing. But it also helps kids as well. Getting kids in the habit of eating earlier and so on. And so, yeah, I think it's a great tool, Jesse, just something, again, to think about. There's apps, of course. I like the app Zero, have no financial affiliations with it, but it's just easy. Hit that timer, and then you're sort of committed to doing this. And then when you're tempted to grab some cookies or ice cream or whatnot, you're like, well, I already started my fast, so I can't, start snacking. So.
Earlier, when you talked about autophagy being one of the benefits of fasting and the influence of exercise, pushing that earlier, meaning you don't have to fast as long to start having that benefit, how long are we looking? Somebody that is exercising on a regular basis, I know there's variability here, but for somebody who is exercising, how long do they need to fast to get that benefit versus somebody who isn't?
Yeah, this is a phenomenal question. Well, that study that I was mentioning, and this was a really well-designed study in June of 2019, these people were only fasting for 16 hours. And they noted, the scientists noted by doing muscle biopsies and gene transcription studies and analyses, that there was a pretty significant increase in the desirable pathways that are linked with fasting. So that's the nice thing to think about is we don't really. I think there was this perception on the internet for several years that you have to eat once a day. That's it. You have to fast for 22 hours or 23 hours a day to get the benefits. But that's really not what the human data suggests. And as I mentioned, in that other study comparing autophagy initiation proteins and all the gene upregulations in fit people who fast versus sedentary people who fast, the physically active people get a quicker induction in terms of fasting. They don't have to fast as long to get some of these benefits. So that's the nice thing. I think a garden variety, 14 to 16 hour fasting window, which is doable for working people, family people. And you're not going to compromise athletic performance or things of that sort, or decrease muscle protein synthesis or things like that. So I think that's the important thing. And again, we can accelerate this, right? Let's say your feeding window, you're like, look, I can only fast for 12 hours because I love food, right? If you think of someone like that, or I'm worried about muscle loss, or if I don't eat, right? So what can someone do? Well, you can accelerate the fast by, let's say you have dinner at 6 o'clock. You can go for a 20-minute walk after that meal. And what that's going to do is that's going to, drive down that blood glucose and insulin, start to increase, fatty acid synthesizing or oxidation type pathways, which are all favorable. And that can accelerate your fast. And then you can also do a fasted walk in the morning, right? And so there's different tools that you can do to sort of accelerate the benefits of this. And that's where I think marrying the best of exercise with consistent, regular feeding window compression is from a longevity perspective and overall health perspective, because look, it doesn't feel good when you know you're getting weaker, when you feel weak, and then you start to identify as a weak person. Then it gets to your head like, gosh, I'm aging faster than I thought. And that's not a good state. I think our mindset is really important. Well, I know it is. And our identity as it's associated with health and health outcomes. So we want to feel strong. We want to be getting progress from our physical activity. And so marrying the best of those worlds, I think, is great.
Let's talk about a few of these factors from the perspective of weight loss, because I feel like this is probably the main reason a lot of people find fasting, get into it, and then maybe stick around once they get to their goal weight and realize all the other benefits. So if you're working with somebody these days with all the information you've accumulated over the years, talk about what kind of protocol you'd put them on to help them in a slow and sustainable way to start losing that extra weight.
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. Like we've been talking about, I think consistency is the most important thing. So consistency with the feeding window, find a feeding window that works for you. If it's 10 to 6, if it's 8 to 4, something like that, where you're cutting off the feeding window a little bit earlier. And then I really underscore this for clients that I do some one-on-one stuff, is making sure you're walking after meals. This is really an important thing to sort of curb and prevent all this what's known as glycemic variability. And that's really the problem. It's not our blood sugar naturally increases and decreases when we exercise, when we go in the sauna, when we eat food, right? But you don't want it to be bouncing all over the place, and you want to minimize the variability there. And that's so important for cravings. That's so important for what's known as the second meal effect. So there's meal to meal changes, right? You have one massive meal with a bunch of sugar. You actually start to crave more carbs and processed foods for that next meal. So keeping that glycemic variability low by taking a walk after meals. And then most importantly, I think that is not really talked about. Well, it's getting more and more popularized, but resistance training as a modality to lose fat. And many people focus so extensively on cardio. I'll just share just a small, side story before we talk about the importance of weightlifting. So I used to be a competitive cyclist. I lived in Boulder, Colorado, had aspirations. I did collegiate cycling, sometimes rode 25, 30 hours a week. I wanted to become a professional. I was training with pros and got to the Pro 1-2 category in Colorado. But here's what's interesting, Jesse, and the reason why I want to weave this story into fat loss is throughout the racing season, I would see people that I was racing with get fatter and more heavy sometimes. And I thought that is so crazy because we are increasing our volume. You start training in December, January, and you start racing in March. And you go from riding, 1 3-hour ride a week to 3-hour rides every day. And you see people gaining weight. And I'm like, how is this even possible? So when people focus just on cardio, what tends to happen is you compensate in other ways by like reward eating and feeding. You start to say, well, gosh, I burned 700 calories in my spin class today. I can have that Starbucks, old fashioned muffin that I've been looking at or donut for a while. You start to make these concessions. And in contrast, when you weightlift, it's much more time efficient. You're not burning as many calories during the actual workout session, but the benefits come after. And so when if you go for a long bike ride and you want to burn fat, you're in zone 2. Okay, it sounds really sort of attractive. Like during the actual exercise, you're burning a lot of fat. Great, right? But what happens after the exercise, right? Because the exercise session is, for most people, 20, 30, 40 minutes. Well, the fat oxidation stops, but here's the difference when you do high intensity interval training or weightlifting compared to steady state cardio that many people gravitate towards when they want to lose weight. When you're weightlifting or doing HIIT training, you're burning mostly glucose. So then people think, well, I don't want to burn glucose. I want to burn my body fat. So therefore, I'm not going to lift weights. That's where we need to reframe our perspective, because when you're burning that glucose in the post-exercise window, the body will replenish that oxidized glucose and depleted glycogen stores, and it will increase fat oxidation to a much more significant degree for a longer period of time compared to just doing that steady state cardio. So I underscore and weave in these stories in the context because, again, many people are so focused. I got to lose weight. I got to go on the elliptical. I have to lose weight. I got to go for that 4-mile run. No, what you really need to do is lift weights and build muscle, cause some hypertrophy, and it's not going to make you bulky. You're not going to look like you took a bunch of steroids. Very few people have the genetics to, especially women, to put on all this mass and turn into a monster. Okay, so push yourself a little bit. Yes, you're only utilizing glucose and burning glucose during the actual workout, but the magic happens in the post-exercise window. And when you do a little HIIT training, when you do resistance training, you're less likely to have the post-exercise cravings and binging that is really common. Once we dig ourselves into a little hole, energetically speaking, and we burn 300 to 400 calories, that's when that post-exercise binge is more likely. And several studies over the years have found that women are a little bit more susceptible to that, meaning you go and do a big run, and you want to reward yourself for whatever reason due to maybe estrogen or progesterone. Women are more susceptible to that. So that's the other aspect that's beneficial, again, favoring weightlifting for long-term fat loss, long-term even cardiometabolic health. We can get into one recent study on that. But it's important to understand that you're not likely to have that post-exercise binge where you crave a bunch of junk and sort of negate the health benefits of your weightlifting program. So to sort of summarize, compressing the feeding window is an excellent thing to focus on. Walking after meals. It can be 10, 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be a 17-mile walk. This is just short and sweet. You're getting sun in your eyes, which is favorable. And then weightlifting at least 3 days a week, preferably 4, and splitting up those workouts, doing some upper body pressing and pulling, lower body pressing, pulling. Brett Contreras has a great book called Glute Lab that has a lot of tutorials on exactly, periodization and sets and reps and different exercises and novelty in that. Andy Galpin did a great conversation with Andrew Huberman on, basically he said, when it comes to resistance training, pick 3 to 5 exercises, do 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 days per week. So it's really simple. Just pick some things that you like, do a few reps, right? 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 5 reps, 3 to 5 days per week. So again, very general advice, but it can be a starting place for people. And then the last thing, and it's not certainly the sexiest thing, is going to bed earlier, getting a good night's sleep. Various studies over the years have found that poor sleepers, these are people that work in the ICU, these are nurses, these are people that work the night shift. Generally, they have more fat than people who get good sleep and who don't work the night shift. So when we sleep, we're entraining that circadian clock system, and we are facilitating normal hormone release with regards to leptin and DHEA and cortisol and all these hormones that influence appetite, influence fat oxidation. So sleep is a very important one to consider.
Well, let's get bigger into sleep here. We talked about before the fact you want to wait at least 4 hours after that last big meal before you go to bed. Since this is so important in one of the 4 pillars you just mentioned, let's talk about other things that you do specifically to make sure you're getting enough sleep and that the quality is as high as possible.
Yeah, Jesse, wonderful question. One of the things I actually don't have here, but I've done some videos on it, is getting a light meter. Is that something that you guys have dove into before by chance?
If you're talking about being aware of like blue light and making sure we're not exposed to screens and stuff before bed, we're big into that. I've never actually measured light in different rooms, but we've changed light bulbs. We've, put incandescent bulbs in certain rooms that we're in at night. And we can get into all the details, but I actually have certain red lights like beside the bed that I use and a red reading light that I use. So very aware, made a lot of changes, but haven't done the measurements. So I'd love to hear more about this.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great that the light hygiene, you're already on that, which is phenomenal. But I do suggest to clients, and this is only a $29 investment, and that's why I wanted to ask you if maybe you had one, because a lot of people are getting them now on Amazon. It's just a lux meter. So the way that you quantify light in terms of the light intensity is the units are lux, capital L, capital U, capital X. It's a lux. And so when we think about sleep, we want to focus on daylight, and we will want to focus on broad exposure to bright daylight. And so the amount of lux that you want during the day is north of 500. So in the room that I'm in right now, it's about 3 to 500. It's not much. So especially in the winter in northern parts of the country, I live in Seattle, you're in Ontario. So we don't get a lot of light. So we need to be intentional about daylight, because daylight helps to entrain that circadian clock system and then induce sleep later in the day. So very important to get a light meter so people know, like, oh my gosh, my room, my office where I spend most of my day is only 250 lux, which is nothing. You want it during the day to be in the thousands. And so this, again, helps to tell the retina, to tell the brain that it's daylight. And so your brain needs to know the differences here so that the circadian clock system can send the right hormones and foster sleep. And then since we're on the topic of light, we'll keep going here. And then in the evening time, you want to minimize it during the 3 hours before bed to less than 50 lux. And this, I think, is quite interesting because a lot of people, we go for walks in our neighborhood and stuff in Seattle, Washington, and I see these people, they have these massive lights on, the TV's on. I haven't brought my light meter in there, but I'm guessing we're probably looking at 150, 120 lux, which is too much light intensity. That is telling the brain, this is still daytime. We do not yet need to release melatonin and all these different hormones that will foster good sleep. So again, the parameters here, as much daylight as you can, go outside for that walk, move your office if you can, read a book, take your call with your earbuds, whatever, outside to get no sunglasses, bright intensity during the day. In the 3 hours before bed, less than 50 lux. And then in the 20 minutes before bed and during bedtime, you want less than 5 lux, which is... So this, I'm holding up a phone if you're just listening in iTunes. This is emitting about 8 lux. Even when I do the dimming thing and I have the color filters on, I know you probably already do that, Jesse. So it's still around 5 to 8 lux, which is too much intense light. So putting the phone to bed. I know Ariana Huffington has talked about this because we're addicted to these things. These are dopamine. This is like heroin, basically, right? It's just constantly stimulating dopamine and so forth. So we need to have good phone hygiene, putting the phones to bed. And as you had already alluded to, good light hygiene, changing the bulbs, getting the compact fluorescents out, invest in the meter. There is a paid app in the App Store. It's a light meter, so you can pay for that too if you don't want to go buy one on Amazon. But I think it's just a helpful tool. So people start to, once you realize like, oh my gosh, my Mac that I like to, read stuff and do these random Google searches at 10 o'clock. Once you realize that it's like hitting 30 lux, you're like, dude, I'm going to stop that habit, right? It's a nice way to reinforce that. But so lights, I think one of the most important things, and exercise. When you exercise, you create more sleep pressure, and that's going to help you to fall asleep and stay asleep, which I think is fantastic. Cutting off caffeine before noon, in your time zone, I think some people are really sensitive to caffeine. I'm not, but back in 2008 or whatever, I would have a cup of coffee at 4 or 5. And I didn't know why I couldn't fall asleep. So then you start drink alcohol to help fall asleep, and then alcohol screws up. So it's this vicious cycle. So I think a lot of people need to be more mindful of their caffeine consumption. And then another thing that I think is very simple, and I believe we've talked about this before, but how you breathe when you're sleeping actually affects the quality of the sleep. And a lot of us, if we think about, we've heard of sleep apnea, right? So sleep apnea is a spectrum. You have normal sleep breathing, and then you have sleep apnea. A lot of us, are kind of right in the middle here, where we have what's known as sleep disordered breathing. So we don't yet quite have sleep apnea, but we're not properly nasal breathing when we sleep. And the challenge with that is it interrupts your sleep cycles within the brain, and kind of gets in the way of all of the necessary sleep stages that are important for detoxifying the lymphatic system and improving and consolidating memories and all these great things that are linked with sleep. So mouth tape, I think, is a wonderful tool that many people can benefit from. I'm sure you've talked about it on the podcast before, but it's, I think, under-recognized, especially for peri and postmenopausal women and men that have some sort of benign prostate hypertrophy and are getting up to urinate. There's actually this interesting connection with sleep disordered breathing and vasopressin, which is involved in cellular hydration and urination. And so a lot of people that are in that category, perimenopause, postmenopause, and have a little prostate enlargement, they think, oh, it's just sort of natural, or just normal. It's common. Common is not necessarily always normal or healthy. It's common if you're in your 50s and you get up to urinate 3 times a night, but it's not optimal. And so one thing that can be helpful is, avoiding large volumes of water within the hour before bed, but also mouth taping. And the physiology with the mouth tape is such that it prevents your tongue from collapsing on your airway when or if you're mouth breathing. So by preventing mouth breathing, you're not getting those periodic apneas. And so you're properly oxygenating your blood. And every time you have apnea where your tongue falls back on your airway, it creates a little cortisol release. It induces free radical or oxidative stress, and it's hard on the heart and cardiovascular system, and then it certainly interrupts the stages of sleep. So very simple. I've bought mouth tape in Canada many a times at Shoppers, at any drugstore, Walgreens, Rite Aid. Of course, you can buy it on Amazon, but if you forget, then you have to wait a day or two. So I just recommend going, and it's the 3M micropore tape, a small little strip here, just horizontally oriented to close the lips, and it helps to foster deep sleep, which is fantastic. And I recommend people start by just wearing it and going for a little walk, a light walk, and getting used to breathing through the nose. A lot of people are like, hey, I have a deviated septum. I can't breathe through my nose. Well, that's a symptom that is problematic. That might mean that you're eating foods that you're sensitive to. That might mean that you have other mold in your house or different factors. But the more that we breathe through our nose, the better our nose becomes at facilitating nasal breathing. So it's sort of this thing like if you've never worked out and you go to work out, oh, my arms are sore, I'm not doing this again. It's like, it's going to get better with time. And so we need to be open-minded with that. But mouth taping and nasal breathing is a huge way to boost sleep quality.
Yeah, I'm a big fan too. Are you somebody who still tapes every night, or now you're used to it and you don't need to?
It's a good question. I've just gotten in the habit of doing that, of taping every night. And so, yeah, people often ask that. They're like, well, I've been doing this for a long time. How long do I need to do it? And sort of the way that I think about this, and maybe this is not the right way to think about it, but for 33 years, I was a mouth breather. So to think that over the last 7, I've been doing it, it's like, well, I might need to do this for a little bit longer and for me to stop. And then the other thing is it doesn't cost much money. The mouth tape is really cheap. But I do wonder, and I'm sure you've wondered this, like, what is that adhesive chemical that I'm putting on my lips? We know the skin is a sort of absorbable organ. Is there any long-term consequences with that? And I kind of weigh the pros and cons and think, well, God, I think better sleep is linked with all these benefits. I'll take the gamble of whatever sort of stickiness or chemicals are on the adhesive aspect. And there's no residual things that I notice on the lips in the morning, so I'm not too terribly worried about that. But who knows? It's probably plastic or I don't know what adhesive is made of. But yeah, so I still do it, to answer your question. But it'd be nice if there was. I hear there's like this head strap kind of thing that you can wear and this and that. But yeah, what I notice, Jesse, is when I don't do it, my dream recall is not as good. So that suggests to me that even though I've been mouth taping for like 6 years now, that I still have periodic times when I will mouth breathe, and I wake up and I'm like, gosh, I don't remember my dreams like I normally vividly do.
And objectively, I know you're a fan of the Aura Ring. What do you notice differently when you're mouth taping versus not?
Great question. Usually the REM sleep is better. I found that with the Aura Ring, I think their systems are great and everything, but if I get more deep, then the REM gets compromised. Like it's never one or the other, both increase, relative. It's like they kind of go back and forth, but I notice my REM is better. And so I don't know what that means, but generally feel more refreshed and so forth. Again, when mouth taping and doing all the things right. But yeah, it's mostly the REM that I've noticed that increases.
Interesting. It's one of those things where I've fallen in and out of the habit over the years, and now I'm inspired to pick it back up again.
Nice. Yeah, it's a good one.
Earlier, you talked about the light, and I love that you took it from both angles. Right away, my mind went to how do we mitigate blue light and make sure we're not on the devices at night before bed. But you also talked about during the day and having a meter and measuring that and making sure we're getting enough during the day, which isn't something I give a lot of thought to. And here in Ontario, you mentioned I'm in Ontario, I try and work outside on the back porch and get a lot of natural light during the warmer months, but that's very limited, the number of, warm months we have here per year. So what I'm getting at is for somebody like us who is further north, and say we get the meter and we realize in our office we're not getting enough light throughout the day, is there a synthetic light, something that you've purchased that you put in the office to boost that, or how can we boost that if we're in a setting where we just can't, get that light from a natural source?
Oh, it's a beautiful question. Well, here's the what's great about that is even though it can be overcast outside, we still that is still like 1200, 1400 lux, right? So a bright sunny day in July in Ontario is going to be 2500, maybe even, up to 3500 lux. But a cloudy winter day is still going to give you far more light intensity than what you would get in your office, even if you have good light. So that's, I think, the important thing to understand is we still need to get outside in the winter. And even if it is, I know it can be windy and cold. I've been in Toronto where it's like howling winds off the lake there. It's freezing, right? But we still need to, I mean, there's benefits to that, right? We can get into brown fat and cold exposure and all that, right? But the light intensity and just being outside, I think that's the important thing is we're the only animal that habitually spends more time inside than out, right? Even chickens that are broody, that are sitting on eggs and so forth, they still go outside to feed and get sunlight. Right? We're the only creatures that spend all this time inside. And to think that our skin and our eyes that there's no benefits to just being outside. I was actually just reading a paper right here titled Food Seeking Behavior is Triggered by Skin Ultraviolet Exposure in Males. And there's much research showing that the skin is actually an endocrine organ that is indeed photosensitive and depends upon UVB and exposure from the sun to induce all and changes. This study actually found more so in men than women that sun exposure, not even being naked, just wearing shorts and a t-shirt, changes ghrelin levels and influences appetite. So this is crazy. I mean, that they were able to figure out mechanistically that, and other studies have actually shown, this was a study in Israel, found that sun exposure, again, this is in the summer months in Israel, was able to significantly increase sex-related hormones that are involved in vitality and fertility, testosterone, DHA in men, and in women, progesterone and estrogen. Okay, this is they again stratified the groups. Some people stayed inside for 20 minutes, and other people went outside and they measured post-exposure levels. And so the sun and the light is so important during both seasons. And again, that's why it's so important. Even if you live in Minnesota or northern parts of Canada, during the winter, if you can go out and do a little walk periodically, mid part of the day, around noon, it is going to help with sleep. And it's going to help with all the other benefits that probably we don't even know about. I guess in China, there's an issue with vision changes in young children. And they're starting to, because of looking at the screen so much and lack of sun exposure, that it's changing the shape of the eyes. And this is research I'm not familiar with. I've just heard through people that are much more versed on this. So we are seeing all these negative changes. And the cool part about it is the fix is simple. Like you said, Jesse, you can take your calls outside. You can bring your laptop to your back porch. You can have that meeting with your coworkers walking. Steve Jobs, right, was famous for conducting business meetings on walks. So instead of sitting around a corporate boardroom, say, hey, let's go for a walk. Like there's a little green trail, green area behind the office. Let's do that. There's a lot of things that we can do. We just need to sort of be a little bit more intentional about how we approach and perceive light. And and then lastly, I'll just say, even studies have shown, and this is sort of getting off the topic of light, but it is related, so it's important to mention here, Shinrin Roku and this idea of forest bathing, just having pictures of greenery and changing your orientation to, so behind this camera, people can't see, I have kiwi berries and an apple tree and stuff. So I'm, seeing vegetation and trees, or even having the pictures of that is linked with better sense of well-being and mood. And so again, it's impossible to disentangle humans from nature. I know we can get into our cars and into our apartment complexes and in the elevators, and we think we're so disconnected from nature, but that is just myopic thinking. And in order to function optimally and to be healthy and to lose the weight, like you mentioned, and I said 92% of people have poor cardiometabolic health. We need to mesh our lives and integrate our lives with nature. And that includes sun exposure. That includes, being outside, breathing fresh air and seeing trees and the whole thing.
And a lot of these can be meshed together. Talking about going outside for the meeting, you could layer on, being with another person versus screen to screen, getting, out in nature, the forest bathing, and getting the natural light. And we could probably even layer on other things too, like better air outside. And a lot of this stuff is so easy, and it's so easy to layer onto one another and get multiple benefits by making small shifts.
Exactly. And it's just changing those habits. And I think the important part that you mentioned, Jesse, is the awareness. Sometimes people are just not aware that, that there's some benefit to just being outside. Even if you're not in the direct sun. They think, well, why would I do that? I don't want to get hot or, whatever. But yeah, all these things. So just the awareness that and we now know humans, at least in the West, we're kind of funny where we need scientific information to then cause us to think that, oh, this is how we should be doing things. Whereas, out in, Eastern Europe or, the Scandinavian countries, people just do things out of habit and ritual and sort of, what people inherently know that this is good so that they do it, like go in the sauna or what have you. But now it's nice. We can convince our very sort of, logical minds that, hey, the science now shows that if you take that walk with colleagues, it's going to be better than on a Zoom call. So then people are more likely to do that thing because we now have the sort of academic research to support it. But yeah, just a little, once we have the awareness, making these shifts can be very beneficial and have a surprising health benefit.
And it seems like human nature, and I know I'm guilty of this as well at times, we're looking for the more complicated way of doing things or something where we're actually putting dollars and cents in. And a lot of these things are just so fundamental and easy and free, and we can implement them right away. But for whatever reason, it's like I'd rather hear something from Mike that I can order online that's complex and I can start taking on a daily basis, and it's more objective rather than just moving my computer outside and getting more sun throughout the day. So for whatever reason, I find it's human nature that we want these more complicated, objective ways of tweaking our health.
Isn't it funny? And so one way to sort of reframe that, my friend Thomas DeLauer has sort of indelibly inked this into my mind is think about sun as a supplement, right? Because so many people will focus on like collagen supplements and all these things. And I take these supplements too and whatnot, right? But if we think about sun as a supplement, you have to take your sun supplement. So it's not just about this feel good, oh, I'm going to have my meeting outside. It's like, if we think about it, oh, you need your 20-minute sun supplement a day, that maybe is a little, again, it's the same thing. It's the same difference. Whatever we can do to induce a habit, I'm all for exploiting that, right? Whether it's the placebo effect or calling something a supplement, call it your exercise supplement, call it, your fasting supplement, and then just think about it and reframe it in that context. And then also too, when we're doing these things, really have the belief that this is having the beneficial effect that it really is. And I think that's a big part of it as well, is knowing that, there's health benefits here and reframing it. But yeah, and then make it a family thing. Like teach your kids, like, hey, let's go outside and do our coloring or our math or whatever. Let's do this outside. And so I'll bring my daughter with me all the time, and get her off the TV or something. Like if she's watching a show, if I'm having a call like this during the summer, then we'll go for a walk and we get the dogs involved. So that's another thing. If people have a hard time getting outside, getting a pet, that you need to walk. That I found that to be very helpful for clients. Is they find that they walk more when they have a pet, right? So all these little things we need to understand ourselves and think what could we do. We know ourselves. We know our tendencies, our weaknesses, our addictions, and what we like and don't like. So sort of create your lifestyle so that it sort of can navigate those unique aspects of our being to, again, make us feel better. So that's I think the big picture.
You mentioned the supplements and sun being a supplement. We could use sleep as a supplement, food as a supplement. You mentioned exercise as well. What other quote unquote supplements outside of the regular supplements have we not thought of yet that people need to consider?
Yes. I mean, are we talking about like right now dietary supplements that are sort of not common?
Well, we'll go into supplements later because that is something I want to hit on with you. But outside of that realm, other than the ones I just named, because yeah, we went over sleep, we went over sunlight. What I'm thinking of right away is things we touched on this quickly, like cold therapy, like different stimulus that we need to get, and we could consider basically being like a supplement for the body that we need on a regular basis that we haven't talked about.
Yes. Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying. So yeah, you hit on it. Thermal stress, I think, is a big one. So like, and we think, a lot of people think like, oh, cold plunges, but both getting hot in a sauna or a hot tub. Again, we now have Western academic research to validate that any sort of heat exposure improves blood flow, the endothelial tone, improves elimination of heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, lead, all of that good stuff. So getting hot, whatever modality you have access to, if your sauna or your sauna supplement is a hot tub at Lifetime Fitness, that's fine, no problem. If you have an infrared sauna, even better. If there's a lot of benefits to sauna therapy, but getting hot and being intentional about that, and then getting cold, I think is a lot of benefits there. You don't necessarily have to do these things concomitantly, but you can do a cold shower at home. And for some people, cold exposure could be taking a walk in Ontario without a parka on in December, right? You don't necessarily need a cold tank, but it's important to understand. And I have family members and things like that grew up in Europe and grew up in London, in the 40s and 50s. And guess what? As kids, they remember getting very cold. And then now it's so easy. We're usually never cold or we're usually never hot. We're always in these thermal neutral zones. And in fact, the very part of the country, at least in the US, where obesity tends to be the highest is a region, you go Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, where it's thermal neutral, meaning that people are in air conditioning in the summer and they're comfortable in the winter. And so we need to get a little uncomfortable, just like how when we exercise, right? We create a little oxygen debt. We create that lactic acid. It's a little uncomfortable, but there's benefits to that hormetic stress. So yeah, so the sauna, I think, or a cold plunge as a supplement is a great thing to consider. And then also, it sounds boring, but relationships and social connection. And so this is, unequivocal. The links with having connection, particularly people. The average person doesn't even have 3 friends that they could call. I think a recent paper that I read. So it's wild. Right? We are tribal, networked and interconnected beings that depend upon other people, and we're most happy when we have those healthy relationships. So that's really important. And then one other thing here in that context is having meaning and purpose. So, getting up and just scrolling on Instagram is not going to improve your meaning and purpose. It's actually going to make you feel worse. So doing meaningful work, giving back in your community, volunteering, if you have a neighbor kid that's going through some issues with mom and dad or something like that, take them out and play baseball with them, take them for a walk, like have a little meaning and purpose, and giving back actually really does wonders for the body and the mind. So that's another thing to sort of consider. I see so many people. It's all about self-care, right? It's LA, right? You get up and you get a massage, and then you go to yoga class, and you do all these things for yourself, and that's all good. But there's not a lot of meaning or purpose in that. I mean, obviously, if you're overcoming a health issue, fine. But giving back to others and making your community a better place, I think that's something that we really should also consider because of the health benefits linked with that.
One thing I want to highlight there that you brought up that I really liked was the comfort aspect. And in the 21st century, given, we talked about light, we often have, the same lighting throughout the house that we're in throughout the day, and same temperature no matter what time of the year it is. So what you're getting at with some of these factors is to push ourselves out of that comfort zone and stress the body in a healthy way, pushing beyond those normal boundaries that we're in day to day.
Yes. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And there are benefits physiologically as well. Now scientists have actually shown, and this was actually a lot of research out of Quebec, have shown that cold exposure changes the function of these fat cells that can become dormant. So I know you have young children, Jesse, and you can remember your babies had a lot of that fat around the scapula and the trap and so forth, the rhomboid area. And so parents recognize this. This is the brown adipose tissue. Well, it turns out that if you were to live in the mountains, where you were to actually work outside, you would still have adequate levels of this brown fat. But again, most people are in this thermal neutral setting. We're not properly stimulating our brown fat. And so it can become dormant. And It turns out that fat is an endocrine organ, brown adipose tissue in particular, signals to muscles, signals to the rest of the body, and can even increase thyroid hormone. So there's a lot of benefits here. And it kind of goes back to that conversation or the question where you said, hey, looks, someone's a little overweight, where they start. We talked about exercise, compressing the feeding window. We talked about resistance training, and then a little cold exposure can go a long way. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, I have rheumatoid arthritis or I have Raynaud's. I couldn't possibly get cold. Yes, you can. This is a process that you can improve upon. Just like if you've never done a push-up, don't expect to do 100 push-ups your first time. You're going to work up to that. And so the ability to tolerate and have both men and women have the ability, studies have shown, because I know there's perceptions, well, is cold bad for women? Well, women actually have a greater degree of post-cold immersion adaptations. And so there is all, the brown adipose tissue activation, this shivering and so forth. Women can induce these pathways as well. So it's something that you train for. And if nothing else, it's a great mental exercise, because getting in that cold shower, going in with friends, better yet, into a river or an ocean, doing a polar plunge in January, like take advantage of that. It's another way to build community. It's another way to make friends. And some of my best memories are with friends jumping in cold rivers, and even in the summer and also the winter. It's like so fun, like things that we remember being so cold, and sharing that moment together is just fantastic. So a lot of online groups that can connect you there, but to speak to what you're talking about, the physiology is well elucidated, and most importantly, in people who are a little overweight or a little metabolically unhealthy, this protective brown fat that induces the shivering and helps communicate there, it tends to go dormant. So it's another thing we need stimulation from and of. And so we need to get cold on purpose. There's a lot of benefits.
So we've talked about these other quote unquote supplements. Let's talk about supplements in a classic sense. First of all, given, our current climate and the quality of food, do you feel like people these days need supplements, or if they're eating a certain way, they can get by with just food? What are your thoughts on that?
Great question, Jesse. So, yeah, I've been in the supplement space since 2006, and I will say that most people generally benefit from supplements. And in a general sense, I'm a big fan of taking vitamin D with vitamin K, K2 specifically. So, a lot of people, even if they go outside, maybe your listeners are different, but people are putting on sunscreen, they're covering up. So vitamin D, vitamin K, very beneficial. Magnesium has a lot of benefits, especially if you're doing the things that we're talking about. If you're sweating, if you're exercising, if you're going in the sauna, you're sweating out magnesium and zinc, and let alone the fact that our soils are not in the same condition as they were several hundred years ago and so forth. So that's, I think, important. I'm a fan of creatine. I know creatine has this perception that it turns you into a bodybuilder and all this. Well, it's involved in cellular hydration, and it helps with ATP synthesis and replenishment during exercise. So women generally tend to have lower creatine levels than men. So I do recommend supplementing with creatine, especially if you're interested in exercise. If people have run their genetics and they have so-called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, in folate pathways that are quite common, 20 to 40% of the population have some aberration in B vitamin metabolism. There's some benefits there as well. And then from there, I think, you cover the basics with vitamin D, vitamin K, little zinc, magnesium, and all that. Then I think it becomes more personal based upon where people are at. If they have SIBO, if they have autoimmunity, if they, all that. But L-theanine can be great for sleep. It's not necessarily a nutrient. It's an amino acid found in tea leaves, but that can help with sleep. So yeah, I'm a fan of helping offset also hormone-related changes. So as we get older, we lose our adrenal glands stop producing or decrease the production of this hormone called DHEA, and it's upstream. If you think about root cause, it's upstream to feeding into all of the different sex hormones that also decline with age. And so DHEA supplementation before bed can be very helpful, especially for men with low testosterone or libido issues. And most importantly, and I think this doesn't get emphasized enough, peri and postmenopausal women, DHEA is going to be the sole source of androgens. Believe it or not, testosterone and androgens are very important for women, preserving muscle mass and bone with age. And as when they transition into menopause, the ovaries stop making androgens. And so the adrenals become the only source of that, and then people have the adrenal issues. So DHEA can be super helpful. But the downside with that, Jesse, is it's not over the counter in Canada. In Australia, you have to have a prescription from a doctor. But in the US, it's an over the counter supplement. So those are some of the basics that I generally recommend for most people.
And when it comes to DHEA, vitamin D, some of these other supplements, do you recommend people get certain testing done before they take them or as they're taking them, make sure they're in that optimal range? Or how do you think about that?
Brilliant question. Absolutely. I think blood work is great. And so I've done a ton of free videos on how to analyze blood work, just your standard Chem24 and CBC and differential that you would get from a doctor anywhere in the world, can give you some insight into overall metabolic health, can indirectly tell you if you need B vitamin support or DHEA, for example, hormone support. So yeah, I think testing is a good way, but also looking at symptoms. There's classic symptoms of thyroid issue, right? Where you're constipated, losing lateral third of your eyebrow, wake up with morning fatigue. So pairing, again, symptoms with labs, because sometimes, just having labs but no symptoms doesn't warrant supplementation. So I think the labs are good. Every 20 or 18 to 24 months if you're under 40, and then maybe every year to 18 months over 40. One thing I think I've noticed with regards to all the Omicron in this is increased blood viscosity with COVID. And so post-COVID, looking at your iron, your hemoglobin, your hematocrit, your ferritin, looking at these different markers that can tell you how thick or how coagulable your blood could be. I found that to be, even in myself, I got Omicron in May and then went to donate blood, and they refused my blood because it was so thick. And I really encourage people to be aware of that blood viscosity and its problem, its links with heart disease and so forth.
I've heard you talk about that in another interview, how men can benefit because we don't menstruate and it's a good way to keep the blood thinner. And then for women after they hit menopause and they're not menstruating anymore, how that can be something free, something that we can all do, also help out humanity at the same time. So it's a win-win all around.
Totally.
And Mike, how do you feel about some of these functional medicine tests, like the Dutch test, getting an organic acid test done, stool testing? Is this something you advocate for the people you work with, and how often should we get that done?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jesse. So I am a fan, but also these tests are very expensive, and I like people to prioritize whole food, to invest in a sauna if they don't have one. So I like people to get the most mileage with the least financial investment. So the first thing that I like to recommend is like a standard blood test, a Chem24 CBC differential. So Chem24 stands for 24 metabolites, and then you get your iron, hemoglobin, hematocrit, some of that, right? And then if there's hormone issues, and if there's low DHEA, or there's menopause, or low testosterone, then I do like the Dutch test. I think it's phenomenal. Great value add there, especially for women going through menopause, men with low testosterone. And then, if people have mold issues or heavy metal exposure, if they have a lot of energy challenges, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, Lyme, I think the organic acid test is nice because it does look at sort of the stop points or sort of blocks, if you will, in the intermediary biochemistry within the mitochondria, within neurotransmitter biosynthesis. So where can you be real targeted with that? So I do like the organic acids in that regard. I think stool testing, if people have a lot of GI issues, SIBO, a lot of bloating, there is certainly benefit to doing stool testing or SIBO breath test, things like that. But it's just not an area that I personally focus on and work with people. I generally will send them or advise them to work with someone else in that regard. Because what I've personally seen is when people make sweeping dietary changes, a lot of the GI stuff generally resolves itself. Now, there's a certain percentage of people who have Blastocystis hominis or other bacteria or parasites that need more aggressive treatment. But it's amazing. People that have had IBS or Crohn's or colitis for a while, and you get them off corn, wheat, soy, and processed foods and so forth, getting on meat, eating more protein and fat, and they don't have those symptoms anymore. So yeah, I think that's generally where I steer people. I know a lot of these doctors online or people you go to, they require you spend $3,000 on testing before they see you. And to me, I think yeah, you could buy a sauna for $3,000, right? Why would you? And that can improve your sleep and do all these things. So for me, I want people to spend the least money possible on testing and the most on healthy, real food. Get a coffin freezer so you can stock, load up on real food, especially with price of foods now. Invest in a sauna, get some home gym equipment. That's where I like people to allocate their resources, not just a bunch of testing, because we got to keep in mind, let's say you spend $500 on organic acid test. That was one snapshot in time, right? The organic acids, right? So you're like, well, what if you had a bad night's sleep? Or what if so we need to understand that these, as helpful as they can be, they're not the end all, right? And so we got to focus on all the lifestyle stuff as well.
Really good point. And when you talked about supplements there, you were talking from a really general sense. But let's tie this back to the fasting piece that we opened up with. If somebody is fasting and they want to include certain supplements or certain, obviously they're not going to be eating during that period, but caffeine, black coffee, certain teas. So basically, things other than food that they can incorporate during a fast to enhance that benefit, whether it be fat loss or autophagy or other benefits.
Jesse, this is a beautiful question, and it sort of comes back to what we were talking about earlier. It depends on how the foods impact glucose and insulin. So the big sort of metabolic signatures that will negate some of the fasting benefits are going to be a rise in glucose and a rise in insulin. And so we need to consider, okay, well, if you have a little bit of coffee and you maybe have some cream in there or some raw milk or maybe a little bit of collagen, how significant would that small amount of raw milk or cream impact insulin? And for most people, it's a negligible amount. Now, here's what I think is great about this, and this is where exercise comes in. Let's say you're compressing your feeding window and fasting and so forth, but within that window, you like a little green tea or you like a little bit of collagen in your coffee. If you go for a 20-minute walk, in my eyes, you've completely negated whatever negligible increase that collagen might have on glucose or insulin. So this, I think, sort of can help people better understand that it really depends on the context there. Now, if you're having a muffin, right? But that's not fasting. That is feeding. So I think it is important that we sort of create these hard, conceptualize fasting as you're not consuming energy, right? But a small amount of raw dairy or cream or little ketones or MCT powder or something. I'm not terribly worried about that, but it's mostly going to be foods or substances that would significantly increase glucose or insulin because that is going to augment, some of the pathways. And yeah, so that's the way I think about it. But again, you got to think about it, the context as well. If you're exercising, if you're going for a walk, what you're doing there, and all that being said, several studies have looked at people, and have fed them 300 to 500 calories on a fast day, and still seen improvements with alternate day fasting (ADF). Still seen improvements in autophagy and these different biomarkers. So it all sort of matters, and that's where I think. If you're going to be having any sort of creamer or coffee or stevia or monk fruit, maybe then you go, okay, well, at least I have to do a 10-minute walk to help negate some of that, post-coffee surge in glucose or insulin.
Mike, I know you got to go, but this has been a lot of fun. Far overdue. I hope we can do it again soon.
That'd be
I
awesome.
love the way that you can take these complex scientific subjects and break them down in a way that us lay people can understand and apply to our health and wellness routine. And I know Max Lugavere calls you a human meta-analysis, and I would totally agree. You just have this thirst for the research and way of synthesizing it in such a beautiful way. So I thank you for coming on the show. We're going to link up your website, your social media, your book. And again, I hope we can do this again soon. Thank you.
Absolutely, Jesse. Really appreciate the opportunity. Great to connect with you again.
Stick around to learn more about fasting with Dr. Jason Fung right here. You're going to love it. I'll see you over there.
The thing about exercise is that it's extremely good for you, but the weight loss benefits are marginal. From a scientific